Welcome, and thank you all for joining us today. This is the last in our three-part floodplain zoning webinar series. Today, we are joined by Gabriel Jackson. Gabe is a floodplain management specialist with the Federal Emergency Management Agency and has been in that role for 6 years. Gabe currently is Region 5's point of contact for floodplain management in both Wisconsin and Indiana. He has a specialty in substantial damage estimation, violation identification, and compliance tracking. Similar to the last two webinars, we are also joined by Sarah, who is the State Floodplain Management Program Coordinator, and Mia, who is the Water Regulations and Zoning Specialist with Wisconsin DNR. Just a quick reminder to participants, please use the chat function to ask questions, and I will be facilitating Q&A at the end. Gabe has a long program to offer us, and it certainly appears to be very interesting. So I'm excited to learn more about coastal management today. I'll pass it off to you, Gabe. Thank you.
Thanks so much for the introduction. I'll turn off my camera in a second, but yeah, thank you so much for having me today. I am excited to give this presentation. We're generally giving this presentation in like a 2 to 3 hour setting, so it is a little longer, but we will get through it, no problem at all. And maybe my little bit of presentation anxiety will get us through at the perfect rate of speed. So I will get right into it. So we're going to be talking about coastal floodplain management today. All right. And can everybody see everything properly? I'm sorry, I'll just do one little check.
Looks good.
Looks good, Gabe.
Okay. So if you know, in Wisconsin certainly, but all around the Great Lakes, there's been some updates. We've been getting some new maps, right? Our data has been getting, a lot better. And we're, excited to give you that information and have you utilize it for your regulation. But now some of our areas are getting V zones. And what the heck is a V zone? So we are, going to be speaking about that today and going to guide you through. And I wanted to start the presentation with a lot of people might have, a little anxiety about V zones. They're new. It's something that we haven't had to regulate to. But don't, just start with a blank slate. I guarantee they're easier than you expect. Okay, so what are we going to be learning about today? And what do you need to know when you're going to be a floodplain manager that has V zones in the special flood hazard area? So we're going to learn, what makes it different from what makes coastal flooding different from riverine flooding and other types of flooding. How are you going to be able to find relevant data for your floodplain management purposes? What are the standards? Because the standards are different than in riverine areas. And of course, how can we reduce the potential flood damage in the area, but without, having our owners feel like we're taking, their property rights or doing a taking. Also, we'll give you a little bit of information about the flood insurance options in the high hazard area. And again, as I said a couple slides ago, this is usually a longer presentation, but we're going to get through it together. And I think the shorter version's a little nicer. So I'm excited to see how well it goes. So this is a good little graphic to kind of show you what we're talking about, right? We're just going to give you the basics of coastal flooding, and this is kind of the basic the graphic that you'll need to know. So we're talking about areas that are on the shoreline, right, and that have the potential for higher hazards, mostly due to wave effects. Okay. So how is coastal flooding different from riverine and lake flooding? So basically, everybody knows from our last couple of presentations, they were wonderful. I'm sure you guys have a great base knowledge, so it's great to have those two first. But a river floods, of course, when it exceeds its channel or if it overflows onto the banks. We can understand that pretty well. And again, it's similar for a small pond or a small lake. It does the same thing. When it rises onto ordinarily high, dry land, then that's when, you're in the flood stage. Again, this causes damages to property, land, and again, this is usually from hydrostatic and buoyant forces from the water. And again, stuff getting wet usually damages things. But coastal flooding is a little different. Yes, those things do happen. Things still do get wet during coastal flooding, but they have a couple other factors that play into it. And that's why we're, with this increased data and our analysis getting better and better each year, we're able to show, some of these in the Great Lakes now. Because at the end of the day, I'm from Florida, and the first time I ever got to the Great Lakes, I swear it was the Gulf. So, you can kind of make the comparison there. But so what kind of affects this flooding, and what do we take into consideration when we do our analysis? So we take in tides, we take in, which is, maybe something that's not too common here, but yes, technically the lakes are still affected by the moon. Currents, of course, waves, which is kind of our larger one, and wind. And wind can push water in ways that you would never imagine. So that's also one of the things that we take into consideration. And again, the coast floods when a storm surge or the rising water combines with the wave effects that generally happen there normally, but are increased because of the storm. And again, that inundates normally dry lands because that is a flood. Okay, so here's a little more information about coastal flooding specifically in the Great Lakes, because coastal flooding was, normally when we think about it, we're thinking about the beach. But technically it can happen, of course, in the Great Lakes and in some larger, wider rivers. There technically have coastal effects or wave run-up effects. But tidal variation in the Great Lakes is negligible. I believe it's under 2 inches from the last study done in 2016. But they, of course, since y'all have lived up here longer than I have, I'm sure you've noticed the lake going up or down. That's just something that occurs naturally and happens either over years or seasonally, month to month, depending on the weather patterns. Storm events, of course, can increase the storm surge in a certain area. And then I think something that we haven't had too much this year, but the presence of ice cover, it can reduce the effects, but also sometimes ice can have a damaging effect if an ice dam were to break or ice, it expands. So moving onto your property and affecting your area. And then these are, what our studies in the Great Lakes are going to be accounting for. And here's 2 graphics that kind of shows us how we do our analysis, the simplified version. Take a quick sip of water. All right. So basically, the WAFIS, or the wave height analysis for flood insurance study, this is basically the simplified version of how we're going to get the data we're going to give you. So if you see that red line there, that is the still water elevation level. And that's basically at a normal time, what the lake sits at. And it's, I believe, averaged over a period of time. And to give you the depth of the depth of the hazards in that water, we do a wave height analysis, and basically whatever the height above that still water elevation is what your risk is going to be. And that's pretty simplified, but we're talking about areas that are these zones are areas that are above 3 feet with this wave action. And then we'll get a little bit into the coastal AE zones, which is something that is not as common certainly in Wisconsin, but not in the Great Lakes. So this is something that happens. It's called wave run-up and overtopping, right? So as we can see here in our last slide, we've got that little bit of run-up going up onto the shore. And this is what happens when you get to a point where that wave run-up goes to a point that it actually can, exceed whatever that elevation is. And it goes on to an elevation that's a little shorter or a little lower. So this, is courtesy of Frank Shockey. A lot of our photos are from Frank Shockey. He was able to go through and, experience this, and really show you an example from our region. This is from, Chicago. So you can see how that can be pretty damaging at certain points. And this is just on a mildly windy day. This isn't during a large storm. So you can see what the potential impacts are of wave overtopping. So what does kind of wave overtopping look like on a map? I know there's a lot of transects here and a lot of gutter lines. But if you look off onto the right, let's see if I can use this pointer. Laser pointer, perfect. If you look over here, we have this section called, zone AO, or, area of shallow flooding. So basically you have a VE zone and there's a bluff here and the wave will overtop the bluff. And then you'll have an area where you just have a little bit of water sitting from all these waves overtopping. This is very common if you've ever visited the beaches of, any of our coastal states down south. This happens quite often after normal storms. They just have a little bit of water sitting in between their dune and the road.
Yeah, a lot of our new coastal mapping does have those AO zones right after it goes like coastal
Right.
VE and then it goes to AE and then it goes to AO. So you might have a, project that would intersect multiple different zones.
Right. And I'm happy you brought that up. You're just seeding that in everybody's brains. We're going to be talking about that in a couple of minutes. But yeah, and again, that's kind of the reasoning there is a lot of our Great Lakes communities have bluffs or little, elevation changes that go down into the lake. So yeah, that's the main reason there. And it's interesting, to see that occur in your community, because these risks have technically always been there. We're just adding them into our maps now because we've got better technology. But so these are some things to remember about coastal maps, right? So this 1% annual chance might not actually happen at every location. So, when we're looking at a river, we kind of have a general idea of what's going to flood at a certain period of time with a certain amount of water. But technically, a storm can change within an hour or within a minute. So if half of your special flood hazard area, gets affected, it's likely that your other half that didn't get affected is going to have any issues. But, technically that can happen in the riverine areas as well. But this is kind of a similar point here, is that one storm event, it might not actually, inundate the entire special flood hazard area. And certainly this water generally doesn't stay for as in simplified terms, as long as riverine flooding. Generally, there's a little bit of a quicker subsidence period. And then again, kind of like everywhere, but certainly for coastal and areas of velocity in riverine. But the firms in, your FRIS, they're not going to do future projections. You have to go out and look and see what's actually occurring in your area. And we're actually going to go through a couple examples of that in a couple of slides. Now, let me move this laser pointer off to the side here. Don't want to distract anybody. But here are the additional forces that are going to be acting on a building when it's in a coastal area, right? So we got hydrodynamic forces, right? Dynamic, we're moving, right? We're smacking things up. We've got velocity, right? The breaking waves and wave uplift. Remember, buoyancy is water's buoyant. As soon as you get that that wave hitting a certain area, anything that's buoyant is going to be rising, but it also has a force that is going, as you can see on the bottom right here, wave run up. All of that, that's got a force moving up. Water is very heavy. What are we at? I think at eight pounds a gallon. So, that's a lot of force when it's moving uphill there, with the force of the waves there. But your high winds as well, that's something that we have to take into consideration in coastal areas. This is an area of topography change, going from water into usually built up structures and or, trees or a bluff. So there is, a wind effect. And something that is very common is windborne debris and also waterborne debris. If you see all of these structures down here on the right, if they were using any of these areas for storage or access or anything like that, a lot of that stuff's back in the water. So it's going to be, re-affecting that foundation at some point. And then probably one of the bigger ones there is erosion and scour. So basically around the areas of your foundation, when you have that wave run up of continuous wave action up and down, up and down, up and down, you're going to take that sand or gravel and you're going to probably move it, into the water. So that's something that you have to take into consideration and, ensure that you've got a deep enough foundation. Okay, we made it to the second section. I think we're doing a really good job. So, how are we going to be actually utilizing the data that we have given you now that we've said, hey, you have to regulate these new zones. So where the heck is the base flood elevation data for a coastal zone? That's a great question, and it can be a little confusing when you look at the FIS. But I have, no fear. I told you not to worry in the beginning, and you shouldn't be worrying now. But the BFE is the number on the map for the area within the gutter lines. And you said, what the heck's a gutter line? Well, a gutter line is here. These is a good example here, Fort Myers, because they have so many different, but basically these white lines here that differentiate between the different zones and levels of elevation for, what the expected water height will be. But as you can see here, we're going from in Lake Erie. We're going to transition from our elevation 585, zone V. Here's a transition of a gutter line. So it's an AO zone, as Sarah and I were talking about before. So just that wave overtopping, you kind of can see there's a little bit of a lip there or a bluff. And then you're going to switch back down, into the peninsula. And I think this might be Presque Isle, if I'm not mistaken. But those are, just something to keep in mind with. It's pretty simple. You go to that map and you're going to look at it and you're going to know exactly what your BFE is in most cases. Of course, got to add that little extra on there, right? So, right, this is in that most cases section. What if the site crosses over the gutter lines? And that's exactly what Sarah had said a couple of slides ago. What if we have all three now? Or what if there's multiple BFEs? So, of course, just like Riverine, we're always going to use the most hazard or the more hazardous zone, right? And we're going to abide by those standards and make sure that, that's the likelihood is, at that point, the damages could be at this level. So let's ensure that we're going to be, reaching the most stringent level. And then use the most hazardous zone, but of course use the higher BFE. If there is a difference in the BFE, obviously always use the higher one. I know it might not be, the most fun for the homeowner, but I guarantee it will be if it's flooding. And then again, if it's a building, the whole building needs to meet requirements if it's a new building or a substantial improvement, which we learned about in our last presentations. But yeah, the whole building needs to meet the requirements, not just having the elevation be a certain height. But okay, so what happens, you're looking at the map and you see, oh, well, these are all rounded numbers. Sometimes when I look at Riverine, they're not. But most of the time, they're going to be a whole number, almost always, actually. The whole number, they are technically rounded a bit. It's a heavy round, right? So it's not exactly the most detailed, but if you were to get in this situation, occasionally the still water elevation is it'll be higher or different than the BFE. Always refer back to the FIS and use the higher elevation. Sometimes the analysis has a discrepancy. Not everything can be perfect, especially with coastal flooding. There's a lot of different variations and variables that go into how we actually get the numbers. So sometimes we just need to have a second look. But again, super unlikely to happen in the Great Lakes. It generally happens more on our in the Atlantic, in the Pacific. Okay. So what happens if if you have a river and there's a floodway, of course, and it meets your coastal flooding? It's similar to our last couple of slides, which basically, with the simplified version, is the higher restriction. And of course, Wisconsin has a higher floodway restriction than most of our states, with no development in the floodway. We love that. But so the higher restriction will always apply. So again, double check that FIS text and look at the flood data table. And again, you can look at the profiles if you have everything digitally. But this is basically just an example of the floodway meeting a river mouth. This was from 2009, so there aren't any V zones on it right now. But that's just what it looks like and what you were to look like if you were looking at their river profile. Okay. So how are we going to be designing and building a compliant building in this coastal zone? So of course, the coastal hazard means zone VE, and it's not as simple as riverine areas. In riverine areas, we generally can elevate things on fill, certainly in Wisconsin, but elevate things on fill. And generally, we can almost kind of get compliant right off the bat, being above the BFE. We don't really have to worry about anything. But this is where, in the beginning, I said, don't worry too much, because we need to have a qualified design professional or an engineer to be involved in designing this structure, if it's a new structure, and redesigning the structure if it's a substantial improvement. So that kind of takes a little bit of the headache off of you. The homeowner there is going to have to get an engineer, a licensed engineer, and at that point, I'm trusting that person more than myself. Their certifications on the line, and I know they're going to be doing the best they can to get everything within the requirements. But again, you'll be relying on your data from the firm and the FIS, and the professional calculations and judgment of that certified engineer. So that will help you out. And again, there's a lot more guidance on this in FEMA's Coastal Construction Manual, or FEMA 5.5. I've got all of the links will be provided in the last couple of slides that I have. Okay, so a limwa and a mowa. So what the heck are those? We love acronyms at FEMA. I'm sorry, I didn't invent that. But in some coastal areas, and we saw this on the maps before, the wave heights might not be more than 1.5 feet, or pardon me, they might be more than 1.5 feet, but they are less than 3 feet. And since they're less than 3 feet, that doesn't make them VE zones. So what is this weird zone? We know that these wave effects are going to have damaging effects. They're similar to actually waves of above 3 feet. So we needed to kind of come up with an area, or show this, and be able to show you this this extra hazard, right? So that's where we kind of get this area, and it's called the limit of moderate wave action, or the LIMWA. So basically, that's the dividing line that goes from waves that are above 3 feet to waves that are below 3 feet. And this area that is below 3 feet, and but more than 1.5, is called the area of moderate wave action. So I hope I explained those acronyms the best I could, but basically it's an area that's still of hazard because of the waves. The waves are a little smaller, but that again is kind of confusingly called the coastal A zone. But technically you can have regular A zones along the coast as well. So that's why it's a little confusing.
Yeah, I think in our coastal mapping, like we don't really have a lot of, like there's almost no
Right.
buildable area that's the on that side of the Limwa. So I don't think that that's going to be a huge issue with regulators and floodplain managers in this state.
Right.
It's
Exactly.
definitely good to know exactly where those are.
Right. And, with future changes, maybe there'll be, I'm not expecting any, extreme changes, but you never know. And it is, good to know. But you're totally right. We haven't seen a lot of this in Wisconsin. We haven't actually seen a lot of this in the Great Lakes at all, which is, good for our communities. But, it's less of a headache to figure out, oh, daggone, these Limwa, Mowa, we don't know what the heck anything is. But, we don't have this, but here's the example. This is what it looks like on the map. So this is the Limwa, that little weird triangle line there. But basically, this won't appear in those AO zones, those where the wave overtops, because at that point, once the wave overtops, it's not going to be having those effects, those wave like effects. It's much reduced. So again, it's uncommon in the Great Lakes. We don't need to spend too much more time on it. But again, we would, if you do have a circumstance that you have an area or a MOA or a moderate wave action area, we would recommend that you use V-zone standards for your construction. But technically, it's not required. It might be required by your state codes, and I'll let Sarah speak to that. But it is not a requirement through FEMA.
Actually, we don't regulate anything differently
Okay.
in AE zones. We don't have any coastal AE zone language.
Right.
So if you're in an AE zone and it's coastal, you basically treat it exactly the same as you would flood fringe AE or riverine AE. So there's no difference in how those are regulated. Development still requires on fill, 2 feet above, and all of that. All of that's still the same.
Yep. Okay. So we made it to the third section. So this is when we get into, if it wasn't boring already, then we're kind of getting into that little section where it's going to be a little more of a drain. But just because we're getting into the 44 CFR, you all know how it is, being locals. So let's get into it. So here's our staircase. If anybody has taken E273, you've probably seen the staircase, and I guarantee you've seen it at a bunch of other places too. We use this quite often, but basically this just kind of gives where in the 44 CFR our regulations are found, and kind of the staircase of how they increase as you go through the regulations. So as you can see, we're at the top, 60.3E. So if you can see there, it says that we have all of these things. We've got our flood insurance study. We know what our BFEs are. We have floodways, and we also have coastal, so V zones. So we've got a higher regulation requirement now. So if you have your 44 CFR open, you can look through it with me. I think the coastal standards are only maybe about 15 pages or so, but you can follow along if you'd like, because we're just going to be giving you, I guess, like smaller versions of the actual regulation, because if I read that whole thing, you'd be asleep. But basically, you have to adopt these for 60.3E regulations into your ordinance when we have identified, when it says Federal Insurance Administrator, just think FEMA, has identified these coastal high hazard areas. But before we get into our 60.3E, we do have to just give you a quick reminder that, once you hit that top of the staircase, you're also still abiding by all of the other staircase steps. You have to make sure that, you're abiding by the minimum requirements at the bottom all the way up through the top. Just because you're now have additional standards, don't forget about the standards that you've always had being in the NFIP. But again, this is just something that you have to be reminded of occasionally, is getting the necessary permits for all of the agencies and also all of the state permits required. I'll let Sarah speak on any maybe additional state permits that are required in the coastal zones. But other than that, no, you just have to, check with your locals, your counties, and your states to make sure you're getting the right thing.
Yeah, I don't think that the requirements are really much different when it comes to the coastal V zones and coastal A, coastal V zones. I don't really think that there's much difference in the documentation that's required.
Okay, perfect. Well, that keeps it easy then. Okay, we're getting into the actual requirements now. So this one, I'm not going to read it all out. You'll get the slides and you'll get the recording. But basically, if you have a structure within the V zone, you should, and you have to, obtain the elevation of the bottom lowest structural member and of the lowest floor. So when we're talking V zones, we're not talking about the lowest floor, the height of the lowest floor anymore. We're talking about the lowest structural member. So the horizontal member that kind of supports the base. And we're going to get right into that. I know it's a little confusing in this graphic. We're going to get into it in real life on the next slide. But this is what this regulation is saying, that you have to obtain that level for your documentation. And again, if the structure's already there, You can work with the structure owner, but this is technically for new and substantially improved structures. So at some point, we will get every structure in the special flood hazard areas information. So, it was hard on that last graphic, but so let's kind of go through this real quick together. So where do people think that the bottom of the lowest member here on the upper left here, on this short, what I believe it's called short masonry piers house. So basically, the wood beams that sit on top of the piers here are considered the lowest horizontal member. They're not attached properly. So we can move on to one that might be a little more, easy to understand. This one right here to the right, and these two photos correlate. So if you were to look at this structure, the lowest horizontal structural member to me looks like this wood piece right here. But when we get closer to the structure, because this kind of, I don't know what this is. It looks like there's been some erosion. I don't know what this is down here. But when you get close, you can see that this actually was a monolithic slab that was, poured in this, basically the, I don't know, I guess what you consider driveway or patio below this structure. And that's actually now considered the lowest horizontal member because it's, it's poured all together like that. So certainly not a recommendation to have a big slab like this. They almost did it. They almost got it right, with the piers and posts. But, this is just something that you have to take into consideration is to really look at that lowest horizontal member. Now it's not, remember, foundation. Okay. Moving right along to 60.3E3. So basically, this is not as applicable in the Great Lakes. So we're going to just touch on it because you don't really have what we call like mean high tide. So it's very similar to what we have in the Great Lakes as the ordinary high water mark. But yeah, the mean high tide in a beach community down south would be, an average of all of the high tides throughout the year, a certain period of time. But here it's the same deal. It's just considered the ordinary high water mark. And you can adopt higher standards, of course, but for our minimums, we're not currently requiring this requirement in the Great Lakes. I know it's a little confusing, but since technically we do not have that described or defined term, we can't regulate to it, properly. So this is just something you'd have to adopt on your own. But basically, don't build your structure on an area that is going to be, in that ordinary high water marks in its path or in its elevation range. Don't build over the water, basically. But we'll work through that when that arises, as we do it in the next few years. I'm sure that everybody will have questions as things happen in their community. So we're always here to help that. But so this is kind of similar to the first one, but instead of obtaining the lowest floor, you have to obtaining the lowest horizontal structural members, elevation, you have to ensure that, any of these new or substantially improved structures meet this requirement. You have to have the lowest structural member be above the BFE. And then the higher standard, of course, in Wisconsin.
Yeah, state of Wisconsin is 2 feet above.
Exactly, 2. So I knew I was going to get it one time. I'm sorry, I forgot the 2 foot, but yes. Okay, that's pretty easy, right? It's the same deal as your regular foundation in Riverine. It's just a different way to kind of describe what you're measuring from. Okay. Of course, similar to Riverine, you have to make sure that your pile or column foundation, make sure your foundation is structurally attached to, of course, the remainder of the substructure to resist flotation, collapse, lateral movement, and wind and water loads. And this is kind of where the engineering analysis comes through and really can help you out, of course, as a local. You don't have to worry about this too much because the engineering firm is going to be handling that when they design the structure. And that's exactly what I was just talking about, right? So a registered professional engineer shall or review the structural design. So it has to be developed. I would prefer mine be developed by an engineer, but if they can review it and certify it, and it's done by somebody else, that's not a problem at all. But then we also have what are accepted standards of practice, and we have a bunch of options here. Like A7, 24. So those are a few options, and those are going to be included in the resources slides that I have at the end of the presentation. All right, here's I think an interesting one. It does look a little different when you have your home elevated on piers and pilings. Might look a little weird. You might get nervous about the neighbor's dog running in there. So you do have the option to have breakaway walls or non-supporting walls and/or like insect screening. That's a common one down in Florida for sure. But that basically can add some aesthetic appeal to your home, but also doesn't impede water or wind loads to a point that'll actually hurt the structure. They'll have a certain psi that they'll break off at, and that's actually right here. And it's so no less than 10. So you're not going to have that thing flying off every time it rains, but also no more than 20 pounds per square foot. So that is something we do see when we have this, this occur. Sometimes the breakaway walls they're attached too well. They're not as breakaway as we want. And that can sometimes, end up hurting the entire, superstructure of the home. So that's just something when you are in this situation as a local to either ask for the design or have the homeowner give you a little demonstration. So that's just something you have in your wheelhouse there. You can use your toolbox. But again,
I would also, sorry, Gabe. I would also recommend to our high tourism V-zone communities to be on the watchful eye for any homes that are built on stilts where they do these breakaway walls, because I've seen plenty of times before where they will completely close it in. You'll see windows put in, you'll see window ACs put in. Now it's conditioned space and it becomes, rental property. And it was very, very common in Florida up until Hurricane Irma, and then all those units got destroyed. But I mean, I don't foresee that really happening here, but just an FYI that you may want to keep an eye on those stilt-built homes to make sure they're not closing that space and turning it into Airbnbs and all that kind of stuff.
No, you hit the nail on the head right there, Sarah. This is the next slide right here. If you look here, everyone, you can see exactly what she was talking about. It looks like we have some storage and access right here off to the left, but what do we have here? This is a little different. I don't know what who's living down there, but somebody's living down there. Or it's a workshop. But yeah, as soon as you get those windows and as soon as you get those AC units, you definitely gotta investigate further. But it's something that you should as a local community, just have a good relationship with the people that are in the special flood hazard area. That's where you should really start, and that really can kind of alleviate some headaches in the future.
And make sure you know exactly where your floodplain properties are.
Yes.
I can't stress
inventory, please. And I guarantee this won't be the first time you hear it from me. And I know, Sarah, it's just something that we are really pushing to know exactly. I'm sure Sarah was just about to say all this, but we do need to know every structure and every structure's hazard in the special flood hazard area. It might be a long process, but start working on it in your blue skies time. But yeah, storage access and parking. No mother-in-law suites or nothing like that. But I know, I'm sorry that this is probably stressing y'all out. There is no fill for V zones. I'm sorry. I know Wisconsin loves their fill, and that's okay. But this is what can happen if you use, and this, of course, was a structure that was built most likely before the V zones were mapped in. So it's a pre-firm structure, but it is an example. So the fill, of course, is subject to erosion and subsidence, and a lot of that it can really damage either large structures or even just the land around your structure. Right here, as you can see, that you're likely on the bottom right hand here, you're likely safe from flooding, but this fill here, even if it's natural or even if it's placed, is starting to be eroded now. And we'll actually get into that in a couple of slides. I got a good example of that from Kenosha County. Okay. Yes, again, no fill for structural support. And this is where we get this question a lot. How am I going to get, my letter of map revision based on fill, so I don't have to pay flood insurance anymore? And, that's one of the main reasons that people do try to get that revision. But there is no letter of map revision based on fill in the VE zone, and certainly no basements in the VE zone. And I'm sure you could think of countless reasons why. So I won't even get into it. But again, what happens if I'm in the AE zone? So just as Sarah was saying earlier, we have a lot of these AE zones right next to our V zones. There isn't a lot of transition in between. So what should I do if I am in that AE zone? As we saw in the last slide, they might be technically in the AE zone here on the bottom right, but right here you have all of this erosion happening. So it probably would be in their best interest to be on a different foundation. But it's a recommendation, right? It's up to you and your community.
Actually, it's up to the state in this case because the
Oh,
state
yeah, even better.
standard. And the state has decided that we're not going to have coastal A zones. So
Okay.
we're just going to build on fill in coastal A zones. So we'll see if that changes. I think it should, but that's a long process.
Right. That's cool. I understand it is always a process. It can take a bit of time. But again, it's just a little bit of information on technical bulletin 10. And basically what it can, and it basically again says that it strongly recommends that structural fill not be used to elevate buildings in coastal I guess A zones in coastal areas or coastal A zones. But that's a night read. If you need to go to sleep, that's something you might want to read into. Okay. Here's E7. Prohibit man-made alterations of sand dunes and mangroves. As you can see, we know who this was written for, within Zone VE, of course, right? So mangroves, I'm from Florida. I'd love to talk about them all day, but they don't grow here. So that's a bummer for me, but not for y'all. But sand dunes certainly do occur, happen everywhere and for different reasons. But for here, we do definitely have sand dunes. They can be vegetative and non-vegetative. I think we have both options. But this is something you need to consider. We're not trying, sand dunes are natural barriers against flooding and against these coastal effects, these wave run-up effects. So we should, not be altering them. And we've actually made this a requirement and it's prohibited. So we have actually a quick example right here that this is the red squiggly line is the limit of the primary frontal dune. So this area right here used to be a really big dune. And if you were in the longer version of this, we'll go through about 10 slides that show the progression of it being built. But this used to be a big dune and this was all open. Well, this is an athletic center and they really needed it to be right here. So they built quickly and realized that there were going to be these changes, that they weren't going to be able to, mess up this dune. And they ended up building it before those changes in these V zones went into effect. But as you can see, the V zones went into effect and you have this big chunk of this very, expensive building, 270 million, in the VE zone. So, or at least in a coastal high hazard area of AE zone. So that's just something you need to review and know your maps. And again, that's right back into it, is know your inventory. Okay, so here just a little information on ACE 2414, which is the flood resistant design and construction. And basically, it's an option for you to review and get a better understanding of how things should be built in these areas. And then if you're not an engineer or you're trying to learn more into it, this will really help you reviewing those proposals that come through for new and substantially damaged structures. And as we've been talking about it all morning, I keep saying substantially improved, because that's when we know that our if the structure is out of compliance, it needs to come into compliance. But again, we talked about this in the last two presentations, and it just is to understand that you should, again, build an inventory of your special flood hazard area and know which one of these homes could be substantially improved or substantially damaged. If it's in compliance, you're not going to have that issue. But if it's out of compliance and it's below BFE, then, make note, and that's where you can start to make your calculation when that happens. Okay, so what makes a successful development project? So here we have some old school homes or condos in 1994, and then a larger development wanted to come over and take over. But this is what we're trying to emphasize here, right? They were in a good position. They ended up being in an area that's, as you can see, behind the frontal dunes, which means naturally it's likely to be safer. So you can see that even with the changes of the beach here because of erosion and maybe even a beach nourishment project in 2013, you can see that they're in a good area. They've done practices that have allowed them to stay. So you can develop in the V zones as long as that as long as you've got a good plan. So if we do have an event, this is kind of the testing of of that structure, of that individual structure's reliability, with its structural components. So what should happen after the event? What should you be reviewing once you're doing your kind of PDAs? So the building foundation should be intact. The building envelope should also be, minimally penetrated by wind and rain and debris. The utility connection should be easily restored. Basically the structure should not be destroyed after a storm, and it shouldn't really even be getting into that 40% mark. That's getting too high. So we'll have to adjust your building practices. And again, right? How long are you expecting this building to last? So let's ensure that we're building them as robustly as possible. Here are some of the challenges, these changes that we're, implementing in the maps. Some of these sites, there might not be an option. It's too dangerous to build, or it's not feasible. So, keep that in mind. Keeping, your mind on whole community development is very important. Making sure that you're doing your subdivisions and your day-to-day administrative duties. As long as you're doing those properly, you're kind of on the right track already. And then something that we really need to emphasize is that insurance only provides compensation when when there's, of course, damages that occur, but the damages have to occur. So having insurance isn't a cure-all. A little note about the vertical datum and height. I know I won't get into this, as much as I'd like, but there has been a change, right? There's a conversion now, and I know you've always done it with, 85, but we're on to 88, better data. And again, we could take an entire presentation to explain the datum of that vertical height there. As I had mentioned a couple of slides ago, the FEMA 55, the Coastal Construction Manual, is a great resource for you. But chapter 3 is titled, identifying hazards. So this is just something that you should probably review if you're going to start having, more development in the V zone. You should, really be assessing the actual area for flood hazards. Our maps aren't perfect, right? So we need you as the local to give us your local knowledge. We need your expertise. But basically, these are your options to basically show how to depict the flood hazards, but also if you do see changes, work on trying to revise those areas that the changes are occurring in. So residual risk equals no risk, right? So we'll get into this in the next slide, but basically, if the site's outside the special flood hazard area, and this is kind of what we just talked about with Sarah, you'll allow the regular standards to occur, and that's all right. But we should really think about how we're going to be building if we're really close to the V zone. The farther away we are away from the V zone, the safer it'll be. But if we're right next to it, how accurate is it? And what are those effects on that individual area? And have they changed over the last, couple of years since we got those maps? So that's something we're going to go through in a quick second. So here's in Kenosha County, right? It's shown in the unshaded, zone X, right? It's not in the special flood hazard area for our regulations. But let's kind of see what happens. So this is 2002, right? That's what the beach looked like. And it's a little grainier, but here's the edge of the home. All right. Things are looking similar in 2015. And, but look at 2017, we're starting to see a lot of erosion, and the likelihood that the lake levels might have been rising, because that happens periodically. And then look, 2018, just 1 year later, you have, the whole edge of the home hanging off right here. And this is 2019 as well. So this is just something you can actually, it's not, the other area photos don't really show how big that bluff is, but, you can tell that's a, pretty large bluff that could maybe be 10, 15 feet. And then 2020, the structure is gone. They had it removed. So again, look at this. The new maps are released, or this, I believe, is the preliminary map and will be released soon. And it's still in the X zone. It's still not even there. So this is where we need your help as a local official to, really try to understand your individual risks as best you can. We'll just have a couple words on flood insurance. I won't speak too much into it. I've provided James Sink. He's our regional flood insurance liaison. I provided his information at the, in our last couple of slides. He's our direct contact. If you've got anything insurance, you should, and of course, hit up Sarah and email her. But also, if you've got more in-depth questions, email James Sink. He's a wealth of knowledge. But so now, basically, your geographic location and the structure's individual kind of like variables will affect how much your premium is. We've gone to an actuarial rating methodology. So if you've taken a course on it a couple of years ago, that it was called Risk Rating 2.0. It is now just our rating methodology. And it's more accurate. And it also is, it's more accurate because we're taking into more factors, and also the site's location, proximity to the flooding source. Okay, and again, everyone should have flood insurance, I believe. And our average premium in the Midwest here is between $400 and $1,500. So that's something that you can work on budgeting. So there are discounts, right? If you were trying to get that premium lower, flood openings, of course, and having the proper foundation in the proper special flood hazard area is certainly something to have as your discount. But elevating your machinery, and if your community is in CRS or the community rating system, as we spoke about in the last presentations, then you can have the potential to get, community-wide discounts. And then, so when we start thinking a little bit about our standard flood insurance policy and what it covers, something that is excluded is loss of land and earth movement. So basically, erosion that happens, may or may not be covered. And that's something that, gradual erosion is excluded. But then you kind of get into the next paragraph where it does say that, there are other options that it might be included in certain circumstances, but it won't be included at all if you don't have flood insurance. So that's something that we'd really like to push. All right, we made it to the end. Congratulations, everyone. But here's our summary, right? Development in the V zones are dangerous, hazardous, and also a headache on to the person who's trying to design that structure, right? They would love to design it in the A zone, I guarantee it. But the Great Lakes, the Great Lakes, they have areas that, of V zones. Our V zones are smaller than comparative to other coastal areas. And I think that we are, able to avoid the V zone, I think, more easily than some other communities. But again, it's always good to have your higher development regulations, even if you're in or out. And again, the flood insurance rates, as I just explained, will be higher the closer you get to the coast, right? Because you're getting closer to a flooding source, and farther away you get, there'll be it should be cheaper. But again, if you're having that slow erosion over 10, 15 years, unfortunately, flood insurance is most likely not going to be your cure-all for that erosion problem. But okay, here is my contact information. And I am the floodplain management specialist for Wisconsin, Indiana, but I do like Wisconsin better. Don't let them know that. I'll get in trouble. But here is James Sink's information and his email if you would like to email him about insurance questions, or if your community would like to set up an information sharing agreement, basically where the community can easily access your citizens, some of your citizens' insurance data. It helps you out.
Would include repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss, the addresses for those, correct? Okay.
Yes, you can get that. Yeah, you can get that included, right? So and just as Sarah's probably about to explain, that those structures that are repetitive loss or severe repetitive loss, those are the ones that you should really be keeping, an eye on and trying to work to mitigate. So it's good to have that information from.
And there's lots of grant funding available for mitigating those
Right.
particular structures.
Right. And here are just a few resources, and the links work. I tested them out, but if you have any questions, certainly give me an email, and certainly I know Sarah is always available. I think I've got done, 2 minutes early, surprisingly. I know I talked really fast, so thanks for bearing with me for that. And I know you might have to re-listen to that recording, but that's the reason we're recording it. But if anybody has any questions, I don't know if they're in the chat or not. Rebecca and Sarah.
Thank you, Gabe. No, there's actually no questions in the chat, but if anyone would like to type one, please do so.
I did a great job then.
I think a picture is worth 1,000 words, and I really enjoyed I shouldn't say I enjoyed, but the image you showed from the city of Kenosha was really very compelling. That shows that some of these zones may not even be the best solution to protect properties. So that was quite compelling. And I think if you can continue to provide examples, graphics, when we're communicating to communities about the importance of floodplain zoning and coastal zone management, I think that's very helpful. The other thing, I know a lot of our attendees are county and municipal folks, and I see them professionally relating to each other and looking for examples. I'm wondering, between you, Gabe, as well as Sarah and Mia, if you have any examples of some of the communities. This coastal stuff is quite new for Wisconsin. So I'm wondering if there's any counties or municipalities that are kind of at the forefront of getting new regulations passed or of communicating about these issues that you could point to as good examples.
Pretty much all of our southeast counties along Lake Michigan have already adopted those standards. I think Brown, Brown County was one of the first,
Mhm.
Door County. We have Bayfield County coming up next, and um, can't remember what the other county is on the northern end along Superior, but those are upcoming, but the ones that already have it, they may be in that ordinance adoption process right now or have just gotten done with it.
Great, thank you. And then just a reminder to all of our participants, these webinars have been recorded. They are available on our webinar resources page. The link is provided in the chat, and you would have received that by email as well. But certainly if you have questions, feel free to reach out to myself on some of the technical, how do I access the recordings, or how do I report this for continuing maintenance credits? Otherwise, you've been given a wealth of resources through Gabe, Mia, and Sarah. So I want to thank our presenters for the entire series. You guys have done an excellent job. Anything else you guys would like to add before we sign off?
I do not have any additions. Thank you so much for having me. I'm just super happy to be able to speak to everybody, and I'm excited, for next year or the next time we do this. So
Great.